we are excited to welcome Paul Chaplin.
My name's Paul, and I'm here really to present an idea. Not just to present an idea, but also some observations, and if you're interested, an invitation to join something that is a little bit different. In the context of the future of work, the idea I hope to share here is that workplaces are hardly understood. There's a phenomenon whose dynamics are observable and experienced, but not easily defined. And yet these are places where millions of people like us spend millions of hours every day. So it's a bit odd, isn't it, that if we asked ourselves, do we really understand what goes on in a workplace? The answer is probably no. I guess most of you will have heard of Microsoft. But how many of you have actually heard of Konica Minolta? We're probably a little bit less well known than most of the companies you hear from today. Who are we? It's a good question because, to be honest, I didn't really know much when I joined the company. There are those of you who probably know us for this. And usually the response is, but you make cameras, don't you? And the answer is, well, we did. But it plays a very important part in terms of where we go next. We still make many of the components which used to make a camera. But rather cleverly, we assemble them in different ways to make different things. The biggest part of our business is print. But we also do some really amazing things that most of you won't see. So we build laboratory measurement devices. We have a special films division. An example of that is that the tinted glass in most of your cars comes from a kind of film from people like Konica Minolta. We have an important medical imaging business. And you can see that all these things come about by reassembling the core technologies of a camera. We're also the world reference, if you're interested, in color and light measurement. So if you read an academic paper about how do you measure light, Konica Minolta is usually in there. But it's also a company that's changing. We're evolving the humble printer into being an edge computing device. We're adding ultrasound and X-ray technology to optical measurement. We've recently launched holographic wearable devices. And most fun of all, we build planetariums. We don't sell many of them, by the way, but so if you want a planetarium, just let me know. You may get the idea that it's quite an R&D intensive organization. There are about 1,500 people working for the company purely in R&D. The reason I mention them is that we're interested and probably present in subtle ways in every kind of workplace. And that's why I'm here, really, is because we're interested in what can we bring to workplace enlightenment. So we're trying to work out what's going on in workplaces, how can we help you, but also how can we make some money out of it. If we talk about science, especially in the context of an event like London Technology Week, my guess is most of you are going to say, you mean data, don't you? Well, yes, in part. The reason that we say in part is that I don't think data is all of the answer. To try and understand that and to understand the context, what exactly is science? So I found a few definitions that you may find helpful. This is one from the University of Berkeley. It makes a nice, clear statement of what science is really about. And I'm emphasizing a couple of points. The first is it's a process of discovery. But what really struck me is that it's about linking isolated facts. And I think that's where the workplace is and where its potential lies, is in linking isolated facts. But that's not the end of it, because over the past 10 years, there have been some really interesting changes in the way science is defined. You may remember from the previous slide, the emphasis was on the natural world. In the last 10 years, the Science Council went through quite a controversial change of definition of what science means, and they wanted to include the social world, not just the natural world, but the social world. And I think this is hugely important for understanding what goes on in a workplace. So it's no longer just data about the physical environment. There's another science we need to take into account. This is kind of a relatively new, what you might call proper science, because there's lots of data and lots of measurement. You could say that this relates to where we work, the environment that we work in. It's very clever and has changed the way the physical environment is built, the way this building was built, and has contributed a huge amount to sustainability. But it has a major flaw. It works best when nobody's around. So most of the modeling around building science works basically around models. It doesn't cope very well with the dynamics of a workplace. And that's what we all know is one of the major challenges facing our workplaces because the way we work has changed. So is building science really enlightenment? It might be part of it. The exciting thing is that there's lots of new data around, and one of the reasons is that buildings have hundreds, if not thousands, of sensors being installed in them, especially new builds. And the cost of sensing is really very low, or the cost of individual sensors is very low. And I got really excited about this a few years ago. But then some people started asking quite hard questions, like, what's it worth? Would anybody invest? And would such new data change human behavior? And if it didn't, what's the point of doing all this sensing? But in truth, we'd missed something. And then we realized that it wasn't just us. We think there's something missing in our understanding of the workplace, the behavior of groups, not just of individuals. You can see from this illustration that really the point is this, that science in its traditional definition is about the natural world. And in the workplace, you connect that with the built environment. But in the social world, there isn't such a strong connection with an emerging science. But we can all have some hypotheses. I'd be interested to know what your ideas are, because we've all had experience of a workplace, and we all have our intuition. So what do we do with them? I guess the real question goes back to that definition I shared earlier about how might we start to link isolated facts? And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So a couple of organizations that I think have done a really outstanding job in building science around the workplace. The first is Herman Miller, who basically sell furniture. But instead of just being a business about selling furniture, they sell huge insights into the way workplaces operate, the way people behave, and the way they interact. And they've been doing that since 1961. The other is Velux. They have the most amazing academic resource around understanding not how to sell windows, but how do human beings react to light, both natural light and electric light? So we think, as a company, there are an awful lot of questions that are unanswered. Things like this. The one at the end is something that we've started working on recently, trying to understand why people sit down for so long. Any answers I'd be very interested in. I'm going to focus on three areas, three quite emotional areas, despite the fact they involve technology to manage them. The first is room booking. So for some time, we've been experimenting with different kinds of room booking systems, and most of them are pretty basic. We've gone as far to design some amazing new functions, but not so far commercialize them. I'd like to, but we're not ready just yet. And what we did was we tried to turn things on their head. Instead of just sticking a screen on the end of Exchange, which is what most of these systems do, we decided to redesign them from the point of view of the way people operate. In itself, a kind of a social experiment. To help you understand the difference between what we're calling sort of ordinary science and social science, if you use sensors in meeting rooms, for example, it becomes quite easy to say, well, how often is this room booked? But more importantly, how often is it occupied? You've all come across this case of, well, actually there are no meeting rooms available, sometimes in our company in Germany for 3 months, because they are booked but nobody shows up. If all you have is pure data, we don't think that's good enough as a value proposition to our customers. So we became interested in things like, well, how do people negotiate to get to things they want? And the interesting thing is that we all do it. You may find, for example, there's a room empty, so let's just take it over. I can see some people are smiling, that's really good. So what often happens is the requirement for space you thought you needed when you booked it changes from the time you book it to the time you actually need it. So for example, more customers show up than you thought, which is always good news, but then you can't find a room to accommodate them. And then you end up in this stressful situation, negotiating with your colleagues, push out some internal people so the external people can come in. These are just simple examples. What we did was we turned our knowledge into mapping out different kinds of functions that would meet a social need. And what we found out is that those social needs are not the same in every organization. So the value of different functions that we developed on the back of social science varies by industry sector. So we're doing quite deep research now as a company into how we operate. But you might say, well, why on earth would you do that? The reason you do this is because you can design systems which work the way people work. You can simplify them in a way that a lot of existing systems for the workplace simply don't work. And you could call this a very early kind of enlightenment. So, a couple more examples. Temperature setting, probably the biggest cause of social unrest at work. If you take the building science view of how to manage temperature, it's done on simple averages. And this is an illustration of how it works. But it results in the average person being happy and the people who are not so average being unhappy. And this is a particular problem, and this would be a really interesting topic to explore, as diversity in the workplace increases, which is a good thing, the systems which have been designed for averages work especially poorly. So we've sponsored some research with the UCL Bartlett School on how to use technology and social science to communicate what our buildings can offer us. But there's a problem here, because what also happens in social science terms is authority. So we can all have great systems, but authority generally messes them up. It means that what we would ideally seek is subject to the way other people think they own you or think they own the space. How can we communicate better about the way space works or temperature works? We kind of got this idea that could we use color, very subtly changing areas of a building, that will signal to people what that space is like. So, lastly, I'm going to jump onto well-being. So this is our latest project. It's very easy to generate data on well-being. This is a study from Boeing. At some point, depending on how old you are, you're going to suffer from musculoskeletal disorder, which is backache or neck ache or shoulder ache. You may also suffer from RSI. There are actually tools around now which are very inexpensive to deploy, which can help you identify risk. It has huge potential, but is actually not widely deployed at all. And we're very interested. If you want to do that, we can help you do it, because we are experimenting and not charge you for it in the short term. The big question is, how is social science going to help us understand our desire to interact and move about? Because if you sit at a desk staring at a screen for a long period of time, you're going to be in trouble. And if you're responsible for large groups of people, your legal obligation is, or the burden of that obligation, is only going to grow over time. So we think that these factors and the way they overlap is really, really interesting in terms of true enlightenment and how that's going to happen in the workplace. We're seeking enlightenment around the workplace. We're seeking to do it by blending traditional science and social science. And we would really like companies to participate in that experiment. That means taking some risks, dare I suggest sharing data, suitably anonymized. But there really is huge potential that is not being particularly well exploited in our view, by sharing data about the way people work and particularly the social aspect of where they work and how.